at this point, then you've got way more DNA options, right?
a, a million times more. So in 1986, really all they had was like what they would call like blood typing, which was like O positive, O negative, secretor, non-secretor. But the problem was is they were so generic. Um, like 25% of any given population could fit into one of those categories. So
Chris Lyons is a former Clearwater police officer, and currently he's a deputy and detective for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. He's also the board treasurer at the Florida Investigators Network, and you can look them up at FININC.org. Very interesting organization that allows participation at various levels for people who are in law enforcement and simply interested in true crime or investigation or the law to participate. Again, that's FININC.org. Now here's a conversation with Chris about a gentleman named Tom Sawyer who was wrongly accused of murder. And having taken up the cold case, Chris was able to exonerate him and get a dark cloud lifted. So here we are with Chris Lyons on the NJ Criminal Podcast. I have a good icebreaker for us. And this is something we haven't discussed. This is actually a good icebreaker, but some housekeeping. I have an interesting sponsor for my true crime content here, or for the true crime content we're doing for the New Jersey Criminal Podcast. And I bet you've heard of this before, so you might not be dazzled, but it's wild to me. It's a company that's called Selfie Background Check, and they let people run all different levels of their own background check. But the ones that I think are the neatest, social media. Like, it'll let you run a social media history on yourself and delete old stuff, because that's sort of the reverse side of the coin from what is going to happen if you're applying for any kind of corporate job nowadays. They're going to run a social media background check.
They do, yeah. When I started at my current job, the young lady who was doing my processing said, what I need to know what social media accounts you have. And I said, I don't have any. And she just was kind of perplexed. And she said, you don't use Facebook? And I said, no. And she said, you don't use Twitter? No. And she threw out some other ones. And I said, no, I don't. I'm a grown up. I don't use any of that stuff. And she was shocked. And I said, I have a LinkedIn account that I use that's for work. But that's it. And I showed her, and it's, very professional, it's strictly work related, nothing political, religious, no pictures of me doing shots at the bar or anything crazy like that you would want associated, with your professional profile. And she said that I was one of the few people in a minority that actually came in that had no social media. But they do that now where they check, because if, your social media, is you doing something crazy on the weekends, or you unconscious in an alleyway Friday night, and you're going to be working for and representing that company, I could see why they would be concerned about that. What always amazes me is when, somebody like is running for political office, and they have, a lot of those people, they're older now. So, they went to college in the 70s, and they have a photograph of them in some modernly awful, politically incorrect Halloween costume, with a big smile on their face. And then it's on CNN, that's no good for them. And now, it's easier than ever. Think about it. People take pictures of their breakfast, so how many moments out there for younger people, who digitally document everything they do everywhere they go, are going to be out there in the future.
100%. It's actually, that's an interesting way to frame it, because I was speaking with Fred, the director of sales and marketing for Selfie Background Check, and I was like, you know who you should reach out to is grandparents and parents who have somebody graduating from college or about to graduate from college and go into the job market, and get their ducks in a row for all the background checks or processes they're going to go through. Or even a high school kid who's trying to apply to college. I bet colleges are running background or social media type background checks anyway. Thank heaven this didn't exist when I was a dingbat 17-year-old and couldn't have hung myself by my own petard with some foolishness. So I count myself lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything from, like I said, motor vehicle, they'll do your social media check and even do a cleanup option. And they've got one that's like a lump of everything, federal, motor vehicle, with continued monthly monitoring. But I thought that was interesting and timely. And I also thought I'm probably going to have some interesting conversations just talking about them as a sponsor, because everybody who comes on is talking about criminal law or crazy court stories. And so usually somebody in that conversation needs to have their background checked or cleaned up. But I'll leave it at that. It's selfiebackgroundcheck.com. I wanted, A, get the bills paid, but B, get your feedback on that and see what you thought, because it was a new one to me.
Can you say the name again so I can write it down?
Selfiebackgroundcheck.com. So speaking of taking selfies, yeah, same concept.
Selfiebackgroundcheck.com.
Yeah.
Just like it sounds?
Yeah, singular, not plural, selfiebackgroundcheck.com.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to look at that.
I'm going to transition. You've got a good story for me. And anytime, there's somebody reaches out to me on LinkedIn with tales of, exoneration, I'm going to put the ball in your court. And without further ado, I'd love to get the backstory or whatever order you've got this laid out in, because you have to have told this once or twice, but would love to share it with our viewers, listeners, etc. on the NJ Criminal Podcast, even though you're a Florida guy. Was this a Florida story? Or
yes, sir.
Okay, ball's in your court. Where does it begin?
So it begins with a homicide that occurred in Clearwater, Florida, which is on the west coast of Florida, mid-west central Florida, in November of 1986. So a young lady named Janet Staschak lived in an apartment by herself. She worked at a cashing grocery store down this way, and she didn't show up for work. So she was a very reliable employee. She was always very punctual. So when she didn't show up for work and didn't call in sick or anything, and nobody had any contact with her, her coworkers became very concerned, contacted her apartment complex and asked, the manager is, can somebody check on her? So the apartment complex contacted law enforcement because her car wasn't there. They go to the apartment and they go in, and unfortunately they find Janet inside, deceased.
Okay. They arrive to wellness check, and from there you've got an issue.
Yes. She was upstairs. There's a 2-story apartment. She was upstairs in her bed, and she had been positioned in a way to make it look like she had been sleeping. Like, she was up on the pillow and had the covers pulled up on her bed, like she was posed as if she had just been, laying there and passed away. But in fact, she had been murdered.
What evidence was there that it was a murder?
So, looking at her initially, she was nude. She was totally nude. She didn't have any obvious marks on her, like a stab wound or a gunshot wound. They did, however, immediately notice that she had residue around both her ankles that appeared to be like an adhesive, like you would find on tape. So she had this heavy residue around her both her ankles. So that was definitely concerning that something had happened to her, and the scene had been staged, not specifically on her, but in the unit on the first floor. There was some blood at the bottom of the stairway, not a lot, but some. I mean, a little is too much in this type of situation, because if she is deceased upstairs in her bed and died of natural causes, why would there be blood downstairs, at the base of the stairs? And then also she had a small living room with a coffee table, and she had like this display case with a like a Bible on it, and that was on the bottom of the coffee table that had been knocked off. And when they pulled back, she had like a throw rug with that was under the coffee table, like centered beneath the coffee table. And when they pulled that rug back, they found a broken necklace with a unicorn pendant on it, and also an earring. So it seemed that something had occurred that probably started downstairs, and then she was subsequently murdered and then posed in that position that she died of natural causes.
Yeah, especially, I mean, adhesive around somebody's limbs is going to raise every eyebrow in the room.
Yeah, and it was visible without a microscope or anything. I mean, you could see the thick band perfectly around both her ankles. So obviously that's immediately concerning. And she owned a vehicle, and her vehicle was not there.
Gotcha. Where does it progress from there? I mean, so clearly you've established foul play at this point.
So to confirm what in our state, we have a medical examiner system. So they send an investigator out of people who work for the medical examiner's office, and then they take her remains. We do all the scene processing, photographs, interviews, try to find out as much as we can. And then they take her body back to our medical examiner's office and do an autopsy. And upon the autopsy, the cause of death was manual strangulation. So she was asphyxiated.
Okay. And who were the law enforcement representations on scene? Was that local municipal? Was that state sheriff? Who was involved in any of that?
It occurred within the city of Clearwater, and they have their own police force. So it was the Clearwater Police Department, and then the District 6 Medical Examiner's Office, which covered the Pasco, Pinellas counties for medical examiner service.
Gotcha. And so now you've got evidence of a crime scene. Now you've got a cause of death that's foul play. So now you're into the phase where there's an investigation for a person or persons. And what does that look like?
So Janet had lived alone. She didn't have a roommate or anything. She didn't have a steady boyfriend. She had been married previously. So of course we want to contact that person and see where he was, if he is jealous or angry or has any type of problem with her, or if he has a good relationship with her. His name was Leo. He did live nearby also in Florida, but they had separated. They had a very good friendship despite their marriage ending. Basically, Leo was homosexual, and this was 1986. So he felt a lot of pressure to be heterosexual and married a woman, but it just that wasn't who he truly was. So after being with Janet for a short amount of time, they separated but remained friends, and he didn't have any animosity towards her, and we were able to put him elsewhere in that time frame. And based on their friendship, we weren't really too concerned that Leo Brown was a suspect.
Gotcha. But yeah, that would be the first person, or the first list that would be made would be relationships or past relationships of a romantic nature, or anybody who had a known animosity, or who had a known animosity, or any type of like, public exchange or something like that. But other than that, isn't it always, I've watched enough of those 48 hours crime investigation episodes to know that they're always looking at the spouse or significant other first, and that the percentages tend to bear out that way. Was there an extended list of past significant others? Was there anywhere to go after Leo in that vein?
She was young, and she liked to have a good time. She had some casual boyfriends that she had been involved with, but nobody serious. And there wasn't anything that seemed to indicate that any of those relationships had turned badly, or broken or ended badly. Those men were separately identified. They were all cooperative. They came in, they gave statements, they provided elimination fingerprints, hair samples. At that time, DNA was a blood sample, and they provided all that, and they were able to provide alibis for where they were, in the time frame.
So the list of most obvious typical suspects is then exhausted. Where do you go from there?
So very quickly, a man that lived next to her in the apartment complex was identified, named Tom Sawyer. And Tom Sawyer lived alone. He was cooperative, and he said that he had previously dated or attempted to date Janet, and that they had hung out a few times, at each other's places and things like that. And for reasons that aren't exactly clear, the investigation became laser focused as onto Tom Sawyer, with him being the primary suspect.
Interesting. I was just, as soon as you told me what he told the police, I was like, man, if they've got nowhere else to look, you just gave them a terrible hunk of information if they're aggressive. I tried to date her and we used to hang out in each other's places. Oh man. Like that's an open door if you've got an aggressive oriented individual doing the investigation, and they're looking not necessarily for where the evidence leads, but they're looking for a suspect. Boy, you kind of just gave them the high level that they need. Tried to date her. Yeah, I can see them getting somebody who's aggressive could use those and just twist it all around, regardless of what the actual, attitude and demeanor of the individual was. I was just like, I've talked to enough criminal defense attorneys that when you said that, I'm thinking, oh, I know there was no lawyer in the room when he said that.
So, I think it's just natural curiosity. If you see on your street a bunch of police cars and crime scene tape,
Sure.
you want to know what the hell happened. I think that is, if it was in my neighborhood, I would want to know. So when he saw that, he had approached them. And also, we do what's called a canvass, which is where you go to all the surrounding homes, in that area, especially on that street or immediately adjacent to, and knock on the door, make contact with that family. Who lives here? Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? Do you know anything? Does she have a boyfriend? Does she have habits? Is there somebody there normally who's now gone? If she had a roommate who's now mysteriously gone, you don't know the circumstances until you really start talking to people. So he spoke to them, was polite, was cooperative, and they asked him to go to the police station to give a statement, and he agreed.
That's not an unusual story, for sure.
No, no, not at all. So he went with them to the police station voluntarily, and they proceeded to become hyper focused on him as the suspect. And at this time, you got to remember, this is 1986. Most interviews were not traditionally recorded. There was still a lot of handwritten confessions and statements and things like that. Most interviews were not traditionally recorded. This interview was 16 hours long, and the entire interview was recorded.
16 hours long?
16 hours with audio cassettes, and they interviewed him for approximately 16 hours.
No lawyer?
No. So jumping ahead, he gave a statement and told what he knew, and then I've read the transcript. It's over 700 pages. The typed transcription of the interview with the detectives, and there are points in there when he clearly asks for an attorney. No, it's not an ambiguous statement. He says, "I'm done. This is over," and they just plow through it and just continue to question him. And this is just a regular guy. He's just a normal man. I don't believe he had any criminal history, and he is in the police station, and these two detectives are interviewing him, and he says that he wants a lawyer, and they just proceed with the interview. So feeding him some facts from the scene, and then also asking him to describe what occurred as if it was a dream. Well, what do you think happened? And just kind of questions like that. They interview him over this period of time, and then they feel that they have enough, and they arrest him for homicide of Janet, and he's criminally charged. And so he's arrested and taken to the Pinellas County Jail.
Wow. I have so many questions that I want to ask about how X, Y, and Z made it to trial in terms of evidence gathered during that interview. If the transcript clearly demonstrates him asking for a lawyer, other than the fact that if he answers the next question, it's a mistake. But anyway, this has a little bit of stink on it from the start. If you're asking me, 16 hours that's a browbeating for somebody who's not prepared for that kind of thing. And they're feeding you concepts to expound upon in terms of theories. Good Lord. What a recipe for disaster.
Tom had previously been a pretty heavy drinker, and he had been in recovery, so he hadn't been drinking. He was trying to keep his sobriety. They described a lot of physical characteristics, like he seemed to be nervous, he was sweating, things like that were they were attributing his physical discomfort to evidence, essentially. where, saying, well, he seemed nervous. Essentially, because he's nervous, he's guilty,
Yeah,
which,
that's a bit of a nonsense approach to it. That's like, a cop manufacturing a reasonable suspicion out of the fact that you don't want to talk to him. Like,
right.
yeah, that's a huge leap over a constitutional line, frankly.
So as I've been police officer longer and longer, I've actually become more. I thought, with all the years I've been doing this, I thought I would become a hard ass. And actually, as I've gotten older, I've actually become more compassionate and more understanding of areas in the gray for people, for regular people. And also, just because somebody doesn't want to talk to you doesn't mean that they are guilty of whatever, you know. Some of the best people that I've seen that give great statements. I had a guy who um, was involved in 3 murders, probably 4. At least had knowledge of the 4th. He was cool as a cucumber because he is a straight sociopath, and life means nothing to him. People are just flat 2-dimensional objects. So to interview him, he was very confident, very polite, well spoken, because he's not nervous because he doesn't feel bad about anything. That was a separate case.
Yeah, it seems to me anybody who's not nervous when they're getting, browbeaten for 16 hours, they deserve a second look.
So in Florida, when somebody's arrested, they're transported to the jail, and then they have a preliminary hearing, which is where they essentially enter a plea of, guilty or not guilty. They can be, depending on the crime, they can be given a bond. And then a trial date is set at some point in the future. Before a trial occurs, there's lots of what they call pretrial motions, and the state attorney's office has to present, it's called discovery. They have to provide any evidence, any witness statements, any testimony, pictures, photographs, recordings, anything, to not only to the court but also to the defense, that they are going to present during, or not only present during trial, but anything that they have to provide everybody with those copies. So when they did that, they provided this recorded statement to the defense, and the defense reviewed this confession. They use that word lightly, and there was a pretrial motion filed for a suppression of that confession, based on that it was not given freely and voluntarily, and that he had asserted his right for an attorney and was not given one.
What was the ruling on that filing?
So they had a 6-week motion on that matter, because essentially in this case, 6 weeks.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah, which is a really long time. So for a pretrial motion, so they had a 6-week hearing about basically specifically the issue of, was that confession free and voluntary, and would it then be admissible in a criminal trial against Tom Sawyer? And the answer was no, absolutely not. And essentially, with that motion won by the defense, the state did not have enough information to proceed, because the bulk of the evidence against Sawyer was contained within that confession, and they filed what's called a no information, which means the charges were dropped. and Tom was released from county jail. I think altogether, I want to say I think he was in jail for about 9 months at that time.
9 months at that time.
Yeah. Late 1986 into 1987.
Wow. Wow. That's a tough one. Goodness gracious. After
So
9 months, you'd want to attach prejudice to that. You'd hope they'd never come back again because you feel like you already punished a guy for something that you never had evidence to bring in the first place. But it I have a feeling this story continues in a not great direction.
so he sued the city and the police department or whoever, and eventually he was given some money to, for his legal fees, because he had to hire an attorney. I mean, he could have used a public defender, but I believe he used a private attorney. Well, quality.
Just for pretrial motions, he spent a bundle of cash for sure.
Sure, he did. I remember he told me that he was a young man at the time, and his parents were still alive, and that they had to take like a loan against their house to pay for everything. They lived out of state. I think they lived up in the Midwest somewhere. But and also you're talking to your parents every day on the phone from the jail, and there's something about murder that even if you were found not guilty, or they dropped the charges. I mean, think about if you were interviewing somebody for a job and they said, hey, what's up with this murder here on your record? And you said, oh yeah, I was arrested for murder, but it wasn't me. And because I think the default belief is that if you were arrested for that, well, clearly they had some evidence to support that you did that, and it's not intentional on people's parts, but I think that a normal person, when they see that someone is arrested for a certain crime, that they feel that there must be some kind of evidence to support that crime. So that stigma of being arrested for murder is going to follow you for the rest of your life, no matter what you tell people. Well, the cops, the confession was bad, and they said that I confessed, but I didn't. No matter how you explain that story, you are always going to come out on the other side looking like the bad guy.
It's not good, that's for sure. You're not, you're going to be the guy who came in and had to talk about why he really isn't a murderer, actually. Yeah, that's a tough job pitch.
Yeah, exactly. Forever, because that's never gonna go away,
So what happens next? So at this point, he's hopefully he's not whole, but he's hopefully recouped a little something. He feels, relief, gets back to life. What goes on at that point?
So he moves away because he clearly doesn't want to live here anymore, and there was some major changes within the police department. This was one of those cases, like a lightning rod. You never want a murder to be, you don't want a not guilty on a murder, but to have the guy walk before case. They were absolutely convinced that he was the guy. So there was also some problems with some of the evidence. There was some problems with some of the items that were retained in evidence. There was some problems with chain of custody. It prompted a very large internal review at the police department. Some people resigned, some people were reassigned. It changed the evidence handling procedures where at that time the Clearwater Police had internal storage for evidence. and the chief at that time contracted with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office to do all of their scene processing and evidence storage for all major cases, to include homicide, sexual battery, officer-involved shootings, things of that nature, armed robbery, and it's still that way till to this day. It also, in 1989, there's also case law against the Clearwater Police Department, and usually you being named in a case law decision is not a good thing. So there was a case law. It was really black eye on the Clearwater Police Department, in terms of that. Essentially, what they felt was that, Tom Sawyer got away with murder. He was the guy, and this case was never going to be successfully prosecuted because this confession was suppressed. They didn't have any other physical evidence, because he had been in her apartment previously consensually. So, that would give, right. So if he's been in there with permission lawfully, any physical evidence could be attributed to those visits. That hair was left behind, fingerprints were left behind. Pretty much the only thing that would put him there at the time of the offense would be his fingerprint in her blood, which they didn't have in that case. So there was nothing that couldn't be excluded or explained by lawful conduct in terms of physical evidence.
Gotcha. So there's got to be a twist here coming.
So in 1989, this, like I said, now it's been in the newspaper multiple times. It, is this big probe into the police department. People retired, people were reassigned. It was not good. So essentially, the case was shelved. I talked to the original detective years ago. He's deceased now, but he was absolutely convinced that the court was wrong and that Tom Sawyer was the guy. Because when I picked up the case as a cold case to start reading it, if anyone involved in the case originally, I want to talk to them, and I'll meet with them. If they live locally, I'll take them to lunch or something and just kind of hear what they have to say. I have to be skeptical, but I want to hear what they say, because there's things that happen that just don't make it into a police report. Feelings, intuitions, and I want to know that stuff, but not that it can be used directly for evidence, but I just want to get their take on it. And he was absolutely convinced that Sawyer was the guy.
Well, I mean, it sounds like it, but if you've got nothing else, a little scrap of meat on the table looks like what you should be going after. I get it. If he'd been there, he claimed to have wanted a romantic relationship or to date. If they've got nothing and nothing else, and you've got some aggressive cat, you've got a problem at that point. If they don't have something better to look at, they're going to look at you till the cows come home.
So when I picked it up and started looking at it in, I think, 2012, I basically had a confession that had been suppressed that I couldn't use. I read it because I wanted to know, the contents of it, but everything in there is poison. I can't use any statements from that. I can't use any knowledge from that. I wanted to be aware of it, but really, Sawyer didn't really have anything really interesting to say. He parroted back some things that had been said to him, but he didn't contribute anything directly to it that was of substance. So when I started looking at it, I said, this is all unusable. I can't use any of this. So I re-identify anybody who's still alive, law enforcement and civilian witnesses, track them down. What are they doing? Where are they at? What do they have to say? Talk to anybody who is willing to talk to me and just get as much information as I can. So the good thing for me is when this case blew up and went sideways, the sheriff's office took all of the physical evidence and held it. And they have a fantastic property and evidence division. It's this huge warehouse, very strictly controlled, well maintained, good protocols in place. And the evidence that hadn't been lost by the Clearwater police when they had it lost or damaged or destroyed, everything that they had turned over to the sheriff's office for storage was still accounted for. They were able to show a chain of custody for it. And the one thing that I was really excited about was I saw that there was what we call a SAVE kit, which is a sexual assault victim exam. So this kit was still in evidence.
Gotcha. And at this point, then you've got way more DNA options, right?
A million times more. So in 1986, really all they had was like what they would call like blood typing, which was like O positive, O negative, secretor, non-secretor. But the problem is they were so generic. You know, like 25% of any given population could fit into one of those categories. So it really wasn't good for including people. It was much better for actually eliminating people. Like if you had blood at a scene
Sure.
and you had victim blood and then suspect blood, which we did not have at that scene. But just for example, you would be able to eliminate the person as being a contributor to that blood if that they had a different blood type. But yeah, DNA as we know it today did not exist in 1986. Nothing even close to it.
So does a DNA test out of that kit, is that cut and dry right there? End of
So
story? Because that's been on a
so
shelf then, presumably just waiting to be tested the whole time.
it's it's just been sitting there.
Yeah.
So I see it in the computer, but mistakes can happen. So I want to see it for myself. I want to hold this kit in my hand. So I go down to the property and evidence building and I said, I want this item, I want to see it. So they have this special little room where we can view evidence. So I put my gloves on and I go into this room and the clerk brings it to me. And what is amazing is it's a box. It's only about this big. It's just this little box and it has all the swabs in it. But what I'm checking for is, one, physically, I want to make sure that the item is there, that it hasn't been damaged by humidity or crushed by something else or whatever, which sometimes can happen. But what I'm really looking for is to make sure that the seals are intact, that I can show a chain of custody that package has not been opened by anybody, and I can show that it's been properly stored, it's been in custody, and that those seals remain intact, that item could still be used as evidence even all these years later. So I look at it and it's amazing. It's got the original handwriting on it and it has the original seals and it's never been opened.
Yeah, perfect. And what's the process for getting something like that? Or wait, what's the impetus? So they're throwing this in your lap as a cold case saying, find something, find a corner that catches, and run with it. And the first thing you did was extinguish a fire by finding a piece of evidence that completely stops the conversation, unless I'm going to be wrong here, but it's going to completely exclude Tom Sawyer, right?
It does,
So,
but
so how many dirty looks were you getting by the water cooler for just making the case go further away from solved?
So ultimately, when because no one wants to convict an innocent person, no one wants to arrest an innocent person. Um, Whenever I've seen anything with false confessions, which do happen, or things where innocent people are charged or convicted, it's not what I thought it would be. It's not the conspiracy of we're going to hold him down and rub his arm all over the gun to get his DNA on the gun, so then we can plant the gun on the scene. It's not to frame an innocent person. It is the investigators are convinced that they are right, and they're aggressive in pursuing the avenue that they feel is to solve the case. They're not manufacturing evidence or anything like that to attempt to convict an innocent person.
Very human. Very human. Like I said, it's particularly if they can't identify anything else that makes sense and they're only left with one thing, what else are they going to work on? It's a very human. Yeah, I can't, again, lucky to not find myself in that position as an imperfect lad. So, yeah, I can see that. And I understand that it's probably not nefarious. I think it's probably, how do you see addressing that is the question. Is that a procedural or oversight thing? Because it feels like when you hear these stories, it's a case of momentum. Like, once something gets steam and once something's crossed enough desks and once the name's been brought up in enough meetings, then that's the case. How does within a police force, and, kudos to Clearwater for at least making moves, getting evidence into a secure new system and making it useful to you a decade later. But what are the roadblocks? Like, is it vary by police force or sheriff's office? And
The,
what do
the
you what do you
two
what do you do to oversee that effectively? Because there are going to be people tomorrow too, and going to be fallible. So how do you stop that momentum once it gets going, kind of thing?
the two agencies that I have worked for in my career have been very good about that. Um, I don't think we have, um, in no case that I've ever worked directly, do we have people that I believe that are innocent that are incarcerated. There have been times in cases where I have spoken up, which was not the popular opinion. Um, in certain cases about what I thought we should do or not do, in terms of investigative strategy. And sometimes I was in the minority. Really, I think one of the most effective things that you can do is we're always trying to prove um, that someone did do something. And I think if you switch roles and try to exonerate them, prove why it's not them, or look at your evidence, argue as a defense attorney would against this case. Like, what are the holes in your case? What points to another person or persons? If you take the opposite view, kind of like on the debate team, if you're pro something and you're passionate about it, it's easy to argue for it. But if you switch to the opposite side and then have to really logically think about arguments about why something is or is not, I think you take a much more objective look at it, which is what I always do in my cases.
Which sounds like you're the type of person who has a general appreciation for what makes the law great in this country. It seems to me that people who don't think about the law, and I don't have a Juris Doctorate, I'm not an attorney, but I've been I've listened to at this point to who knows how many hours of criminal defense conversations. And in my estimation, if you're not thinking of it in very clear terms from how would both sides argue it, you're not really thinking about how the law works. Because
No.
yeah, so I think I actually find it's you have greater appreciation for the topic in general, conversationally, not just when you're trying to investigate a case. Like, but it seems to be, it is a bit of work, but once you sort of cross that bridge and you think about, because all these criminal defense attorneys who come on and, you know, they've had clients like Tom Sawyer, they're always talking about not just, well, here's what we needed to do. But the only reasons they needed to do that was to counter the case of the state and, you know, block things or address things. It really is the only way to have a evolved or real fruitful conversation or outcome is to examine both sides as fully as you can to the best of your ability, I think.
And we're only as good as our worst actor, you know. So as I've gotten older and I see the government do or try to do things or not do things that I agree or disagree with, you know, you have to think, would I want the might of that turned on me? You know, basically, I try to put myself in somebody else's position. You know, if we're doing something with, you know, especially nowadays with technology, with, you know, cellular devices or things like that, you know, would I want that used against me? Would I want that used against um, an innocent person? You know, so some of those things I just they don't apply in this case because the case is so old that those devices didn't exist. But I think, you know, we get some really access to some really amazing investigative tools. Genetic genealogy is the hot topic right now.
Horrifying.
What's that?
Horrifying.
Horrifying.
Yeah, yeah,
So
because you're going to get busted, not because it's going to be your cousin who gets you busted now.
yes, yes. So I'm involved in a regulation committee to determine standards and practices, best standards and practices for genetic genealogy. I have made, this is not a genetic genealogy case, but I have made cases based on that. And it's right now, at one meeting, a genealogist called it the Wild Wild West because there is such a push for this technology. You know, and the law, I mean, we're the government, we're slow. Everything is 10 years behind where it should be. And by the time some legislation gets enacted, you know, this tool will have already been around being utilized for a long time. So, you know, you have to use it with caution and discretion because it's such a powerful tool. But my concern with it is the ability for family members of the, you know, if the true proper suspect is identified, that family members are outed and their only crime is being genetically related to someone who did something awful. And then, you know, the news reporter is banging on their door, sticking a camera and a microphone in their face, asking for a comment that they're, you know, third cousin twice removed on their mother's side committed a murder in Toledo, you know, and they don't even know that person. They're not even, you know, friends or, you know, they're genetically related, but that's it. So I try to be very cautious of people's privacy, that they're not, I wouldn't want that done to me.
No, and it's anyone who had the foresight to collect hair samples from all their acquaintances for the last 20 years can frame anybody they want for anything they want, as far as I'm concerned. If they've got a good plan, if you were thinking ahead, I mean, I'm just hoping
So,
my
so on
DNA
a
is not collected somewhere for use, you know.
So on a side note, DNA, we're always our own worst enemy. We want everything stronger, faster, better. So DNA has actually become so sensitive and so powerful now that we are getting secondary contributors on things where we didn't used to because the kits are so sensitive. So I saw at a trial, basically, there's an old defense attorney, like a court presentation where he or she will take like a sheet of paper and pass it around to the jurors and then write, this is a robbery, give me the money, and he basically is saying, well, your fingerprints are on that piece of paper, but you didn't know that that piece of paper was going to be used in a bank robbery. But by you holding that blank piece of paper, now your fingerprint is on it, which implies your guilt. It's kind of like an eye-opening moment for some jurors, because they're like, oh my God, it makes them doubt evidence. But with DNA, the kits are becoming so powerful that we're getting secondary, what we call touch DNA, which is like shed skin cells off of clothing, where we'll swab a victim's hands who was maybe murdered, and we will find multiple profiles of just people that he or she had contact with in their life, just
Oh
friends.
boy.
So just because the DNA is there does not mean that that person is instantly your bad guy. And also, the absence of DNA does not instantly exonerate that person. So it's like you have to look at everything individually, and it's very difficult. There's no one surefire magic bullet. Everything works every time. Cell records, same thing with towers and cell data and stuff. We use it to include and exclude people. There's nothing that is surefire every time, every way.
Yeah, fair enough. I think you're just scaring me more though. It's and so essentially then, to jump back to Tom quick for my own closure, that's it. He's got peace, at least with the Clearwater police going forward from that date, because you're saying just as happy to say, oh good, it's better to know, it's better to.
So with Tom's case, when I got permission to submit that DNA kit to the lab, we were fortunate in our county that we have our own DNA lab. They do a fantastic job. I contacted one of the DNA analysts named Beth Oderman, who first worked for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and then was recruited to work for the Pinellas DNA lab when they opened in 2010. And basically, she's been with that organization since the beginning. But I knew her, I respected her opinion. I talked about the case, and I told her what I wanted to do with the submission and why, and she was completely on board with it. So she developed a DNA profile from that rape kit from Janet. But that doesn't mean that DNA kit, that male DNA is your killer, because she could have had consensual sex with a man at 9 o'clock, and then he leaves, and then she's murdered by a stranger at 10 o'clock. So you just because that DNA is present, of course, do I want to talk to that person and know who they are and where they are and everything, and either include or exclude them? But the DNA itself is not instantly that he's the person. So Janet had DNA, an unknown male contributor. That my first question was, is it Tom Sawyer? So we still had Tom Sawyer's samples from 1986, and they were able to eliminate and say, no, absolutely not. The DNA under her fingernails and from her sexual assault kit is not Tom Sawyer. So then I said, okay, what about these other fellas that she dated? And they had all provided samples too. So they do what's called a one-to-one, and she goes through and eliminates all of them. So it's not any of these men that she was friends with or had relationships with or boyfriends. So they're all eliminated. So it's none of these guys. So then we get she was what's called a CODIS administrator. CODIS is like the DNA database of convicted offenders. So there's a local level, a state level, and a national level, and it's called LDIS, which is LDIS. Then the state level is an acronym that I can't remember, and then the national level is NDIS. And so she searches it at the local level, which means any profile developed by that lab, and nothing, no hits. So she searches it at the state level and no hits. So she does a one-time search at the national level, and we get a hit from a man named Stephen Lamont, who was, and the reason he had been in the DNA database at the national level was because he had committed a robbery in the state of Alabama, was a prisoner in their corrections system. Therefore, he had to give his DNA. The only problem was Stephen Lamont was in prison in 1986. So how is Stephen Lamont's DNA inside and underneath the fingernails of my murder victim in Florida when he was in prison in 1986? So I had to consider the possibility of an identical twin, which, of course, in all these cases, it's like a Scooby-Doo mystery. There's every bad guy seems to be an identical twin or a triplet. It's amazing. So we start looking into this guy. It doesn't appear that he has any siblings, but I start doing research into, is he anywhere in the original case file? No. Is he have anything to do with Florida, that he's been here, anything that I can find? No. So when I start doing research about his sentence in the Department of Corrections in Alabama, I thought, well, maybe he earned a furlough, which is like a temporary release, and then you have to report back on a certain day. I find that he actually escaped from prison, him and 4 other guys. So he was in this prison, and at that time, the prison used to use inmates that had like technical knowledge to do repairs in the prison. So him and these 4 other fellas were doing electrical work in the prison. So they used their knowledge to create a like a simulated fake power outage, and in the ensuing chaos, these 5 guys were able to escape the prison. So 3 of them were caught very quickly, like within 12 hours. And Stephen Lamont and another guy named Donald Ard got away, and they made it outside of the state. So I don't want to go confront my suspect yet. He's free now. Stephen Lamont, he's living up in Alabama, and he had no interaction with law enforcement since his last arrest, where he did this prison sentence and then was released in like 1998. So Donald Ard, who is still an inmate, he did 2 murders, and he was serving a life sentence. So I go up to Alabama and I meet with Donald Ard, and for a murderer, he was actually very friendly. He's an old guy now, and I ask him about this prison escape. So he tells me about it, and they're kind of very proud of how they engineered this escape and stuff. And he tells me, they get out and they go down and follow the railroad tracks into Florida. And he said the other guys get caught right away, but and he remembered Stephen Lamont. that him and Steven continued into Florida. He said, we slept in the day and traveled at night, and we just followed the railroad tracks. And basically, once they got into North Florida, they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. And he said, I never saw him again after that. Ard went to, I think, Texas, and because he had some friends and family there, and was there for not too terribly long a time, and ended up getting picked up again and returned to prison. And he didn't know what happened to Lamont. He said, I never saw him again after that. I never heard from him. I don't know what happened to him. So that was interesting. So I'm able to confirm that Lamont at least made it to Florida during this escape. So then he's not in any Florida databases or anything like that. So I take Lamont's fingerprints from his conviction in Alabama, and I have it run through what's called AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system, as an unknown, because I didn't want to run it as his name. So I give it to one of our examiners, and I said, these are fingerprints of a guy. I want to see if he's been arrested in Florida under a different name, because especially with the 80s, some things are digitized, some aren't, nothing's perfect. So I have his fingerprints run, and Stephen Lamont's fingerprints come up in a Clearwater, Florida arrest in 1987 of a traffic crash. So I get the booking photo, I look at the fingerprints, and it's Stephen Lamont. So the examiner confirms that these fingerprints are this guy who was in this Alabama prison, and he was arrested under a fake name in Pinellas County of Keith Minshew. He was involved in a minor crash, fled the crash, bailed out on foot and ran, and an officer caught him, and he was booked into the jail on like a $500 bond. He bonded out and then was gone, never to be seen again. There was a warrant in the system for him for like 20 years under this alias name, but he was never relocated. So now I can put Lamont in Florida, one, because of the DNA, but he escaped from prison. So I'm able to show that he had the opportunity, that he was free, to commit this crime, and that he did, in fact, come to Florida. So we go up to Alabama, and we go to his house and contact him, and his wife was there. And we say, we don't identify we're from Florida, but we say, hey, we'd like to speak with Stephen. Can he come to the Shelby County Sheriff's Office, which was the county where he lived at? And she calls him on the phone. We go to the sheriff's office and wait. And a short time later, him and his wife come up. And ultimately, over the progression of about 3 to 4 hours of an interview, it started off with never been to Florida, don't know her. And then I was able to show that he had been in Florida. Then I was able, and I confront him with the booking photograph, and he says, well, I had to give them a bad name because I was this escaped prisoner. So I knew that they would send me back to prison. So then he gets confronted with the DNA, which he denies for a little while, and then he says, well, I did know her. We were like casual boyfriend, girlfriend. And it starts out as, no, I didn't know her, was never there. Okay, I knew her. I came home and found her dead. I came home and as far as he would go was we were having consensual intercourse, and I accidentally choked her to death while we were having intercourse. And then I had to flee because I couldn't call the police or anybody because I was this wanted prisoner and stuff. And I just fled. We had found her car at Tampa International Airport, which is just east of Pinellas, and that fact was public. It was in the newspaper, but I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, just basically to like throw you guys off, like to make you think the killer took her car to the airport and then got on a plane. He actually just said he took the shuttle and just came right back to Clearwater and was living here like in an efficiency apartment doing construction type work, and was here for quite a while after because he wasn't arrested in that traffic crash until 1987, and this murder occurred in 1986. So he stuck around here for a while. He worked his way west through the United States, through Texas and Arizona, and eventually on a traffic stop in Arizona, he gets pulled over for something and they can't find his license and they're playing the name game. And then he just eventually, he said, I had been running for a while, and he says, I just couldn't live the life on the run anymore. So I told them who I really was, and they arrested me and shipped me back to Alabama, where he served out the remainder of his sentence and then a little extra time for escaping. But he's also much older now. He was in his late 50s, and, he was your typical working class, swing a hammer, 2 packs of cigarettes a day kind of guy. He'd lived a hard life. He was only 58 when I was with him, but he looked much older just by the nature of the life that he led. But I called the prosecutor here and told them what we had, and it was the same prosecutor from the 1986 arrest. His name is Richard Ripplinger, and he had been at the state attorney's office that entire time, so he was involved with this case as well, from in the first time and the second time. He says, yes, you've got enough. So we completed an arrest warrant. He was arrested right there and then extradited to Florida. And we contacted Tom Sawyer and told him about it. And he actually came down here and was at his arraignment. And at his arraignment, he pled guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life. And at this time now, he's almost 60 years old. 25 years effectively is a life sentence, 60 to 25. So that would make him 85, where he would just be eligible for parole. So essentially he's going to be in there, for the rest of his days. But the best part of it was I got to meet Tom Sawyer and spend a little bit of time with him. They had done a show about this case, and he was here and they filmed him and stuff like that. And he was just so grateful that, because he said, I always had this cloud of suspicion hanging over me, that, and he said, also, I was always worried that at some point there was going to be a knock on my door and they were going to arrest me again, that there's some kind of new evidence or something.
I would imagine there were thoughts in his head that somebody might kill him someday because they thought he did this and got away with it. I mean, that's a terrible cloud to live under for sure.
Yeah. His parents had both passed away, so they never knew, the truth about it. He said they always supported him and always believed him, but he was upset that, his parents had passed away and didn't know the truth, that this person did this. Back to what we were saying earlier about the truth about fitting the evidence. So when I interviewed Lamont, do you remember the broken necklace that I told you about?
Yeah, an earring, right?
There was an earring, but there was a necklace, and it had it was circular, so it had the large flat part that sits against your chest, when you're wearing it. So I had that necklace tested for DNA, and the broken necklace, and it was Stephen Lamont's DNA on that broken necklace. So that supported the theory that there had been some type of altercation. I had a photograph of it printed, and in the interview, I put it in front of him, and he just looked kind of shocked. And he said, "Where did you find that?" And I said, "Where do you think I found it?" And he says, "I don't know." He says, I had a necklace like that, but I lost it years ago. And it had like a unicorn on it. It was kind of interesting looking. And, but it was right in that area where where the book was knocked off the lower display thing, and the necklace was under the rug, under that throw rug. So that was one of those things that the physical evidence supported the theory of the crime, which for me, that just made it, I mean, it didn't change anything in court, but for me, it just made it a little bit stronger that the theory that I had about what occurred fit the physical evidence.
Wow. It is heartbreaking that his parents were not around for that. Like, of all, it's, I hate for that to be my takeaway, but it's one of my takeaways is, man, I'll bet he was bummed. I'll bet he was just like, oh, like that's rough. But overall, as positive of an outcome, I mean, I've heard enough of these stories that they never end like the movies. And this is as positive of an outcome. I mean, from your efforts and some of the, changes made in Clearwater that led to, you having some good quality, well represented evidence to dig back into. It's kind of a positive story other than all the terrible, terrible aspects of it.
Yeah. I mean, all we can do with cases like this is when something happens is to learn from it and to adjust so that it's not repeated. I mean, this case involved a few different interesting elements. Yeah, I mean, criminally, it was solved by the use of DNA, which really isn't that interesting anymore nowadays. There's a lot of cases that are solved by DNA where a suspect is identified. But to me, the false confession angle, and then the fact that not only was I able to identify the true suspect, which was gratifying to identify and arrest the man and give Janet's family, some answers after all this time. But really, I think actually the for me, the best part of this case was actually to be able to exonerate Tom Sawyer.
I can only imagine. I mean, that's really, I can only imagine the weight off his shoulders. Like, that cloud's got to be brutal. Like, I can't, that must be kind of a nice thing to lay your head down at night and know you've genuinely, truly, measurably made somebody's life better to live, for sure.
That was a very, very satisfying part of this case. I got to meet him and spend a little bit of time with him, and he was very grateful, that we were able to do that after all this time, because he said he just basically thought, that no one would ever know, and also, I mean, and Janet was his friend and his neighbor, so he was incorrectly accused and incorrectly charged, and then forever this is following him around, that he killed this person that was his friend that he had nothing to do with.
Was there much press coverage of the conclusion? I mean, his exoneration and the Lamont conviction, was all of that well represented? I mean, at least if he were to get Googled, is the first impression is somebody's going to have now, like, oh wow, that's terrible, thank goodness he got exonerated? Or is it still like,
Yeah. Our local paper here at the time, it's changed names now, but I think at that time it was the St. Petersburg Times, and they did a series about it, and they had some shots of Stephen Lamont in court. They had some shots of Tom Sawyer. They had Tom Sawyer's original attorney from 1986 that won the motion to suppress, you know, all those people. The detectives, the original detectives, weren't really involved. They were all retired. And I told them, you know, before it was going to be released publicly, and they had been asked, you know, to give interviews and things like that. But the main detective is now deceased himself. But you know, I told him the information about what happened and everything, and he was grateful that we were able to get some closure for Janet's family. But you know, I mean, he was old. He was probably in his late 80s, but he was able to accept that he was wrong.
I imagine you would have to have accepted that you're wrong once or twice as a detective. Like, I mean, you've gotta have to eat crow a couple times if you're in the business for a couple of decades, I imagine.
It was that was hard, you know, because you don't want to do anything else intentionally to make someone look bad. That wasn't my goal. My goal was just to find truth. But that case kind of, he retired, you know, basically at the conclusion of that, and had otherwise had a very good career and was a well-known, well-respected detective locally. So I'm sure with his career concluding like that, that always, you know, going out on a bad note, to say, you know, was very frustrating and disappointing to him, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's like I said, such is life. Like none of these stories ever end like the movies. None of these drawn out cases. There's just too many layers to the onion. There's too many complicated human aspects to it. And if everybody on the other end is like, well, maybe I feel terrible, but I think this is the right outcome. Maybe that's the best you can ask for, is everybody to feel terrible and have the right outcome.
What do they say? Um, you, when you go to bargain, that if everybody leaves like they got something, but no one is completely satisfied, that's the best of the mediation. So, I mean, I feel like in this case, you know, with the facts and information I was given, that was the best that I could do. I think the outcome was the best as possible, you know.
Yeah, that's a heck of a story. So many levels to those types of, and we could probably talk for 2 hours about any of the singular steps that we listed as bullet points for like the progress of the case or your investigation. It's, you know, there's probably a lot behind those that inform the path you took that we didn't get to cover. But I will say this, you did bring up the genetic genealogy and the fact that you're on a genetic genealogy council. Don't be surprised if I reach out to you one of these days and we have a conversation about that, because I do think that's a hot topic. And for anybody who got lost when we were yammering about genetic genealogy, what we're talking about is like 23andMe and these websites or services that will do your genealogy if you send them DNA. And what that has created essentially is now a worldwide lattice work of DNA database where if anybody in your immediate or extended family has gone out there and used one of these services, you're in the lattice work now, basically. Like
So
you don't have to donate yourself, but somebody around you could. And
so
clarify if I just put my foot in my mouth.
I there's a lot of information out there that's not correct, and we're definitely going to have to do this again just to talk about all that stuff. So I am in there myself, and I am opted in for what's called law enforcement sharing in GEDmatch, because I wrote an article about it. Basically, I would not ask a member of the public to do something and help us in a way that I myself would not be willing to do. So I think it's only fair that if we're asking people to contribute and share that information with us, that I lead by example and do it myself personally. So I'm in the matrix.
That's fair. And I also can't complain to you because you're also participating in the Genetic Genealogy Council. So you're trying to get ahead of what rules need to be in place. You're part of the people trying to at least put this on rails so it doesn't.
So it's a balance because you want the investigative ability to use it to solve violent crimes, but you also have to respect the privacy of individuals and family members in these cases, and that it's done in a way that is can be replicated and can be shown and demonstrated in court and would pass what's called a Fry standard, which is basically like a competency exam, show your work, prove your work type and there have been several challenges like that. But I mean, if we're using it to incarcerate people for serious crimes like rape and murder, I think that's only fair, I mean, not everybody believed fingerprints were a thing when that first started, and then DNA had to be proven. And if we're going to utilize this in a court of law to as an investigative step, it's because everything is still confirmed with standard STR DNA, which I don't think most people really understand. But if we are going to use this as a vehicle to get to that point to prove somebody's guilt, that we have to be able to explain it and show it to people.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I don't know how many factual inaccuracies there were in my brief little snippet about it, but if you've got a list, we'll have you back to talk about that. And is there anything else, or is there any business links or anything you'd like to promote in closing?
So my wife and I, my wife's also in law enforcement, part of this investigation, and then also I got to meet David Rudolph. He's an attorney in North Carolina. He represented Michael Peterson in the Staircase. Did you watch that on Netflix?
No, no.
It's fantastic. It's about a homicide of a lady named Kathleen Peterson. Um, it's domestic related. There's a lot of, and it's all true. It's a biographical, story, and it involves um, the judicial system, police investigators, defense attorneys, evidence, experts. I use that term loosely with blood pattern analysis and things used to convict Michael Peterson in the first case. And it's very, very interesting. If you get a chance, I would highly recommend it. But I got to meet David Rudolph, and he did a presentation. I was able to arrange for him to speak to a group of homicide detectives, about 200 of us. And I had stars in my eyes. I was very, very excited to meet him. I got to take him to lunch. But my wife and I, based on just both our careers in law enforcement, we founded a group called the Florida Investigators Network. Our website is fininc.org, FININC.org. And it is most of these organizations that I've been involved in are restricted to law enforcement or closely associated fields. So I really wanted to bring in more like college students and people, attorneys, defense attorneys, because I've done presentations in front of 200 or 300 people that are all cops, and honestly, it's pretty boring. I explain about what happened, I go through it, and at the end, there's usually no questions, maybe one or two, but there's not a lot of debate. the most interesting presentations I've done is when there's people who are in different fields, or there's defense people in there, or some type of specialist, or maybe like a fingerprint examiner or a DNA examiner, and they look at things from a different way. But some of the best conversations I've had have actually been when there's criminal defense attorneys in there, and in a constructive way, where we are having an interesting discussion, because it's all, theory and conjecture, until whatever happens in court happens, but so we allow, in our group, basically anybody. We have 5 categories of membership. They all cost the same. It's $30 a year, and you, based on what your job is, we have like citizen sleuth, who can just be anybody, like true crime junkie, what we call legal eagle, which is people in the law enforcement or criminal justice professions. And so really anybody can be a member and see and talk about these things in the cases, because if you have 200 like-minded people together, there's not going to be anything really interesting to talk about. So this case, and then seeing the staircase, and just really kind of open our eyes to it, and a need for an organization like this. And we're a nonprofit, and it's just something, one of our side projects that we do is something interesting, where we try to get interesting case speakers and presentations and things like that, to discuss interesting cases.
That's wonderful. And that's great that it's like an open organization, not just because it probably leads to more interesting back and forth, but also because like it goes back to offering people a true understanding of one of the things that genuinely makes our justice system better than almost any other. There's places in this world that are quote unquote civilized where there's no presumption of innocence. It's quite the opposite. No. So I think it's awesome that you have something where people can learn about the law and learn about what really happens, and not that the TV version, but the real kind of stories, I think, are where people develop enough of an appreciation that they're more interested in having a conversation that examines both sides, which is what you do.
I saw just the other day a trial that's going on in Florida now, where the state wanted to have a witness testify via Zoom, and the defense had no objection to it. The judge had an objection to it. He said, I am not certain that the defendant having being able to, the right to confront his accuser, that a Zoom screen meets the constitutional burden of confronting that person and having them present testimony in this case. So I was really surprised, because I expected, the state presented it. They had obviously spoken to the defense ahead of time, and the defense had no objection. And then the judge said, if I allow it, and it there was like a beat in the court for a second where there was like a pause, and then they had to explain what they were going to do, how they were going to do it. I almost thought he was not going to allow it. The defendant had, they had to excuse the jury and have like a sidebar, and he had to go through and say, swear the defendant in, make sure that he was okay with that he understood that, he could have the person there, that they could object to it. And what he was doing was the judge was setting the ground to make sure that there was no
appeal,
post-conviction appeal, because he said, I'm telling you right now, we can stop this and it cannot occur. But what I do not want to hear a year from now is that if this case doesn't go your way, that this shouldn't have been allowed, and that it cost you, being convicted. So the judge was very, very forward thinking on that. And it was very interesting. But because a few years ago, I mean, if you had said that you were going to have a witness testify via Zoom, it would be absolutely insane. And I've seen it now in a few trials. I've seen it routinely in depositions, and I'm starting to see it more frequently in open criminal court. So that's like what we were speaking about earlier with the technology moving faster than the pace of the law, where your accuser is on a digital screen and maybe hundreds or thousands of miles away, not there in court. The judge brought up everything about, that you lose the ability to read their body language, to completely understand how they're reacting to the questions on direct and on cross. And he said it's just not the same. And it was really, really interesting. And I think as time goes forward, that's going to continue.
The judge is right. The judge is smart. I mean, I've had the conversation going back to when COVID was shutting down courts, and we're following what New Jersey's decisions were and how they started having all these virtual trials. I mean, nobody wants to hear this for sure because it's a positive shit show of a concept. But you can't convince me that unless every judge in every criminal trial took those steps for every single defendant during COVID, during every Zoom trial, I got a problem with every single one of those defendants in terms of their constitutional rights having been met. Because if the person who got arrested for the same crime as you, they got arrested a month earlier? So they got to be in a room and they got to have there was a jury, there was their accuser. All of a sudden for 2 years, you're doing it by Zoom and you want to pretend that that's equal representation under our Constitution. I would argue that till I was blue in the face. That's not equal. There's no situation in which you can convince me that it is. And unless the judges are disclaiming the hell out of it in advance, very foolish, I think. So I love everything you said he did, which is, right from the point of, if I allow it, and here's why. Because smart dude, smarter than me. That's why he's got the robe.
They were very surprised that he said that. And then the way that he explained it, I thought was, on his part, was very, very smart to avoid, that appeal in the future. And, obviously it's case by case. And, in some cases that are of like with the Lori Vallow case out in Idaho, Doomsday Mom, that judge allowed audio but no video. But then in another case, a different judge allowed audio and video. So they wield a lot of power in that courtroom as to what is allowable.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should save some of those and do deep dives. But other than that, I'm gonna give a shout out to FinInc, and that's .org, right?
Yes, sir.
FININC.org. Maybe even sounds trite when it's such a weighty subject that you really had to dig through, but from an outside observer like me, very impressive.
Thank you. I'm very grateful that I got to work on it.
The best way to follow, subscribe, rate, or message the show is to visit njcriminalpodcast.com.